I know that all of you are not familiar with the strange paraconcept of the complaint. I know you never complain, and you have no rapport to this kind of subphenomenon of utterance. I will open this, of course, to discussion. I'm going to mix it up a little tonight and go from different sectors of the work I've been trying to do around this very strange and yet pervasive form of being in the world. I'm trying to think of grievance, forms of protest. I'm also considering the downgrade of the lament and the difference, but also reciprocal contaminations of lament and complaint, including the problems of legal complaints, medical complaints, and other ongoing types of, let's say, dispositions of complaining. In some cultures, complaining is great. In others, it's considered unhöflich, impolite, and unacceptable. So, needless to say, as in many kind of minoritized traces, complaint is often made to stick to minorities and women who are nailed for bitching and moaning. And so we're dealing with a form of utterance that has often been feminized or culpabilized, has often been dismissed. Children should please shut up and stop complaining. And then, however, if you look at even classical music, or Beethoven was interested in the switch over from lament to complaint and what it means. So I'm interested in analyzing the disenfranchised language of muted rage. Not that I have any such issues. You can treat me like a TV, hit the pause button, hang out, ask me questions. I come with subtitles. So I actually want you to understand what I'm saying. I don't always, but tonight I do. And some of this, I think, is very understandable at a certain hermeneutic level. And just do with it what you will, and then we can start bitching and moaning together. But this will be also a question of grief and grievance and a culture and institution that is bloating with grievances against any perceived misstep that a professor or a colleague might have incurred. So I'm very interested in the way, let's say, radical professors get taken down and out by a new culture of grievance. Of course, I'm a Nietzschean, so I see good grievance and bad grievance. I switch on the transvaluating machine and see how, and I'm also deeply ambivalent about everything and everyone, so you'll see how I slalom between the poles of an affirmable complaint, the necessity and exigency of launching and lodging complaints, and also the complaint that can get great on your nerves. So shall I begin? How's your energy? Should we do some yoga, or are you ready to bring this up? My friend E says that all of Protestantism comprises one long complaint, a ceaseless session of meckering, he says in German, or carping. This contention made P laugh when I told him about it. He added that Luther's nailing the list of grievances on the church door of Wittenberg starts off the complainants' movement, a fracture in Christianity linked to the Reformation, which is a sort of cover-up term, Reformation. On a more personal note, P reminds me that I used to despise complainers, the whiners and snivelers, the scores of kvetches and chronic grumblers. I don't remember complaining about this sector of Dasein, but I can believe it. I worked hard at emulating ego-ideal poses of obduracy, at most softening Zen practices of non-preference, sheer acceptance when one wishes nothing to land, be, move, or posit otherwise. I would neither be dissatisfied nor satisfied. No fear, no hope, just lean into the emptiness. But enough about non-me. My friend M says that in Buenos Aires, the opening salvo of sociality consists in massive complaining. It's simply not polite to break into a social encounter without ragging on your parents, your horrible lovers, and your friends who betray you. This initiatory clearinghouse of hospitality makes space for newcomers. I like it. Nothing irks me more than having to hear about family hugging, lover bedazzled opening rounds of assertion. Such an embrace of pre-approved world defies my comprehension. I will go to Buenos Aires and make new friends. For the French psychoanalyst Roustan, so I'm now DJing into another, I'm scratching and popping elsewhere. The complaint issues from one who wants to keep intact her chagrin, if only to avoid, or her unhappiness, her suffering, if only to avoid confronting it head on. In a way, he rebukes the complaint for not becoming a lamentation, a rite of passage. In fact, for not becoming. So the complaint, according to this psychoanalyst, contemporary and severe, is something that is stagnant and stagnating and is not part of becoming. The complaint, he argues, ought to have given way to an aesthetic mise en forme of pain, a reorganization of the beauty of expression, trying to catch up with a disorder perceived in its first stages as irreparable, an elegy meant to begin the work of closing a mourning period. But to the extent that the complaint persists, and this is the analyst's complaint, it persists. It remains instead a repetitive fixation that feeds chagrin rather than exhausting its course. The complaint that does not finish itself off or move up the ladder of formal transformation actually increases pain, opening only on a condition of depression that with each passing day becomes more irremediable. So this is the analyst's despair, and by the way, in his book, La fin de la plainte, so the end of complaint, shortly after that, he quit being a psychoanalyst because he couldn't stand his patients complaining all the time and jacking up their suffering. So in this way, the complaint belongs to the refusal of an imposed reality, something that may have overwhelmed my existence and relational systems, the rumbling of a terrible event, disruptive and inassimilable. Faced with the unmovable event, this is an aspect of event that we didn't discuss in class. Does it move at all? I, as patient, become tired, depleted, unable to effect the existential and material modifications required of me if I am to change things. I remain in the rut of the complaint over and over again, preferring to deny that something has happened to me, to my world of structured accommodations, specific grammars of avoidance. The event insists, it imposes itself, however, for it won't go away. For Roustan, when the complaint runs out the clock, stabilizing only its concourse, it has become a way to evade facing the event. Of course, if we bring in Heidegger and Derrida, this would be a question: can one face an event? Does it have a face? But the psychoanalyst says that instead one can regret its occurrence and encroachment, one can deplore attendant facts, one wants, wishes for, demands a time and place when things were different. Continual complaining means that I have been unable to appropriate the overwhelming event and assume responsibility in some way for its onslaught and implications. This is when fault is assigned to another, be it destiny, society, heredity, the genitors, my messed up parents. La plainte, on vient porter plainte et à se répondre en accusation. So the complaint is always, the Klage, you could say in German, is always an Anklage, or the complaint is always accusatory and just spreads and proliferates accusations, always pointing to the other. They're messed up and so on. Does anyone recognize themselves in this, by the way? In a way that proves critical, judgment is suspended by the complaint and condemnation staved off as the event continues to develop consequences. One develops a pervasive sense of encroachment. One feels shaken down, squeezed, and surrounded by enemies, and begins permanently adopting the figure of one persecuted. As much as the complaint resembles a rebuttal to injustice, evincing recrimination, maybe indulging a subtle Nietzschean dose of vengeance, because Nietzsche claims to detect a subtle dose of vengeance in every complaint in the untimely meditations. Nothing of the sort will rise up or amount to much, for the subject of complaint, according to Roustan, remains obstinate, stuck in process, with the faulty understanding that the order of things must change and not mes propres sentiments. So it's not my own disposition or feelings or feeling tones, but things, the world has to change. What happens is that a state of division reigns where no reconciliation is possible. Complaint has existential takeover plans, attaching to everything and nothing, crowding out life's capacity to endow and enrich. So the complaint will halt your multiplicities, your ability to give yourself up, to abandon yourself to life's richesse. One of the sticking points of complaint, according to Roustan, is found in the way it blocks out forms of consolation or overcoming. The complaint issues from the stunted lifeline of childhood wounding. Something happened and has not ceased to happen, continues to hurt, that cannot be ignored by an analyst or therapist who needs to consider how the complaint était le fruit de l'impossibilité de vivre, arising as it does as the impossibility of living life at an early age. So already at an early age, the one who ends up being stuck in the rut of complaining experienced an impossibility of living life. The wounding struck so deeply that it prohibited any new growth. In this area of being, obstinacy holds intact an infantile part of the self. The complaint is an effect of the refusal to grow up, or it expresses at least regret over having grown up. Staying in place, dissatisfied and stunted, this still shot keeps one hooked on the cherished self of childhood that remains frozen in a pout. The complaining subject is thus protected from plunging into the pain of growth or the agony of those spurts, those growth spurts, which limits the astonishing abundance of life's donations, so readily available, according to the therapist, as part of the very risky prompts of overflowing generosity, free-floating gratuity, and the adventurous frontiers of friendship and love. So let's talk in class tomorrow about the overflowing generosity of being, the Es gibt in Heidegger of Sein, that being is that which generously gives. But here you see a kind of inability to avail oneself to that fundamental and originary gratuity, granting, and gifting of being. Resentment, reproaches, requiring that others give us what in principle we cannot receive, these are held in place by the complainant closed in on himself. The narcissistically retrograde patient running at top speed on empty needs to learn how to wait. We've been talking about waiting. Needs to learn how to wait. Maybe in French this directive becomes more eloquent, for the patient needs to patienter, to assume her patience-ness. Be patient. It's very hard. Any complaints? Okay, so now I'm switching over. For Friedrich Kittler, who was the techno-scientist of Germany, also a colleague at this school, the encounter with German letters is softened by a seufzer, a sigh. Even though he turned out in long stretches of his legacy, because of his work on technology, to be a man's man, he fires up the technological libido and shows ballistic drivenness, delving into forbidden war cathexes, sleuthing in the cut-off narratives of our time, revisiting shrouded theaters of battle and the persistent glare of computer terminals. So Friedrich Kittler analyzed the Wehrmacht, the Nazi army, and all the computer terminals without ever saying, hey, by the way, I'm sorry, or something like that. But that would be, that's something to discuss. But he's a very tough theorist of all of the war technologies. And since we're in a war museum, we might greet his spirit. Kittler started up his own engines with feminine accents, as if to match his long flowing hair and sweet-toned accent. He brought to the podium the sprightly, forgotten, but crucial Bettina von Arnim with his unforgettable paper, Into the Wind, Bettina, a now legendary intervention first offered at the colloquium on the genre organized by Nancy and Lacoulaba, where Derrida presented the law of genre or gender. Finsk and Hamacher too were on site, as were Sam Weber, Paul Deman, and so many other A-listers in this Woodstock at Strasbourg of German philosophy and literature. Kittler's voice was commanding but softly supported by his lilting inflection and tender intonations. Swabian. A soft-spoken advocate for any number of lost causes and genders in those days, He was capable of summoning up women's reading habits in the 18th century. Nietzsche's initializing stock of girl students. Nietzsche was the first to invite girls into his classroom, whatever you think of that big misogynist. The flooding of the secretarial pool that changed the fate of letters and love stories. Men started writing up the collective transference onto the secretary and Gal Friday figures. Today we talk about cleaning women in literature, but Hitler brings up the new influx of secretaries and the figure of the Gal Friday, all of those new writing machines that turned on men, and films and are objects of all sorts of artworks and literatures. The sudden population boom of Della Streets and Lois Lanes. The first time that ladies was added in the form of a public address. This was an event when it was said, ladies and gentlemen, meine Damen und Herren. And Hitler zooms in on this. When did that happen? And what an event, what a still reverberating event. And he also famously zoomed in on the Ach of Sprache, the ache of spake. I don't know how to translate that. The indwelling alas that he drew from language. So Sprache, speech or language, has Ach embedded in it. He observed, in fact, that German literature commences in a sigh. He writes, Die deutsche Literatur hebt an mit einem Seufzer. So it engages, gets into gear with a sigh. If we had time, we would think what kind of an utterance or non-utterance or intervallic moan is a sigh. Is it a complaint already? Somewhere between moan and lament, Seufzer rings out at the starting gate of the literary adventure, tilting toward the eternal feminine of language utterance. One is tempted to say mutterances or mutterances in a translinguistic sweep that involves a maternal marker. Mutter and mother, mutter, and the English drone of muttering, something that gets said under the breath. So what does it mean to mutter, and where could are there any taxonomies that could accommodate muttering under your breath? Just below the sonic level of sense-making. Perhaps the mutter is, by the way, Badiou talks about the mutter, and I never mind Badiou. Perhaps the mutter is a way of revving up the complaint, as well as the inventory of German literature. Is one addressing oneself, a split-off part, or simply falling chronically short of a proper address when muttering to oneself, following the covert boomerang trajectory of the whimpered shortfall? So what is it to mutter to oneself? Yet this is how Goethe has Faust, the great monumental startup text and machine of modern literature, and this techno monster, Faust. This is how Goethe has him start off when he opens the scene of the modern German language, the startup fund of German literature. Habe nun ach, Philosophie, and so forth, mutters Faust. The scene opens on a complaint, just as Werther enfolded the right to complain as one of the principal themes of the Sturm und Drang suicide novel. Do you know what I'm referring to? Are you cool? Are you good? Faust groans that he's at a dead end. He has done all the work. I've heard this from a lot of people. They've done all the work, they know everything, yet knows not enough of what really counts, that is the incalculable, and cannot be satisfied by mere knowledge, the cognitive levers available to him. Nor can he be expected to keep himself in a restricted Kantian zone of knowability. This is a loose translation, but on point and battle ready. And I'll defend these points against any philological busybodies. Faust, breakthrough work of German modernity, comes online with a hysteric's wish for more. So many of us have discussed and remembered the Freudian joke that asks, what's the difference between a hysteric and an obsessional neurotic? The hysteric says, is that all there is? The neurotic, stalling, stopped short by the overwhelmed sense of encroaching things, says, this is too much, I can't handle it, to the same event or object. Faust opens up the hysteric's demande for more and better, but with Ach interceding, there is the matter of an initiating surrender, a ready resignation, the place where the complaint strikes out demande. I will unpack this elsewhere to show how on another register the complaint serves notice to the analyst, functions as the psychoanalyst's defeat, erasing the demande, an intrigue for which analysis must pay back all sorts of psychic loans. So analysts can't deal with the complaint. It swerves away from the demande that they might be faced with. Hitler could have chosen, I suppose, to render Ach as a groan. So what's a groan? Following the schema of sexual difference proposed by Shakespeare in Richard II, when a sigh is apportioned to the feminine, the groan to the deposed king, Richard II, which inches its way toward the feminine, but still retains a more of a masculinist majesty as the unkinged mans up. So if we had time, we would now consider the new injunction that we have in American culture to man up, which indicates that one has yet to retrieve or attain to manhood, for one is clearly not man enough if one still has to man up, lasso the transcendental ideal of manliness, but I leave that to the side. As the king takes leave of his queen in Richard II, each repairing to a different type of banishment, he coaxes the separation. Go, count thy way with sighs, I mine with groans. The shaky difference between a sigh and a groan, do you all know what a groan is the only remnant of sovereign decision. A sonic signature anterior to language, landing somewhere in the vicinity of Shakespeare's famous "The rest is silence," but not quite unheard of. The sigh that initiates German literature grew up in the neighborhood of the swoon. A swoon is a recurrent figure in German literature of the 18th century. And there are certain moments when someone just faints and consciousness is eclipsed. So the swoon marks a kind of eclipse of meaning that populated so many texts of the 18th century, where the experience of Ohnmacht, or fainting, losing power, powering down, has said something about textuality and its diminishing capture, its suspension of consciousness at moments of decision. In Kleist's Marquise von O, the protagonist faints and the text follows her down by instituting a dash at the non-rendered core of events. The narrative ceases to be, it cannot say what has happened. The evental pivot of the story disappears into avoided syncope. We are given to understand by the insertion of a diacritical mark, So the dash, what happens when, and this is something that Goethe and Nietzsche insist upon, that you follow them into their dashes, where language stops. And in her case, she's impregnated, so she has a bloating figure that the text was unable to control or tell about. For Kleist, the origin of inscriptive saying, here and elsewhere, is smeared by an initial violation. Everything subsequently grows around the textual gash, a traumatic seizure that marks the dilemma of all texts. Tenacious silencing and embedded disturbance, an origin that cannot testify to its taking place, knowing no witness or advocate to haul in a lost causality, some generative principle to call up hospitable ground. Is this too difficult, by the way? Shall I continue? Okay. The text, left to fend for itself, ducks into corners, substituting for storytelling with a stock of trip-ups, dissents, and blushes. So I'm interested, as you can tell, in the sub-phenomena of utterance, all of which indicate something like a complaint. And now I'm landing on the blush, which has a lot of anthropological, ethnographical, and shameful history, because the blush as a moral sign of humiliation or shame was said only to be, that only certain skin colors and pigments, namely white of course, could display a blush or moral anxiety. So it's something as minuscule as the blush opens up all sorts of outrageous dossiers that you might want to consider. So the blush in particular serves to carry an entire phrasal regime in Kleist that vies with muted language. The red splotch, or the splotch that you may have read, is it readable, is it unreadable, registers a level of affect or meaning that remains at a loss for words, uncontrolled, unreadably lodged between shame and excitement, so it might suggest that you're turned on. Confession and disavowal, it indicates the bleeding qualities of a text that swarms over its boundaries into shock areas that cannot be subdued by meaning, or even for that matter, perceived. In the case of the Marquise, one wonders if the blush speaks for her at moments when she cannot stand up for herself, or does it rather betray her with a sudden spread of skin mapping, releasing a secret or indexing a moral blemish, a pigmentation in concourse with the scarlet letter and birthmark of Hawthorne's brandishing. In a beautiful story, by the way, how to read this red splotch on the face in Hawthorne. In some instances, the blush manages to register a complaint for the reticent Marquise, and it signs off on an unspoken accusation. As blossoming of sense, blushing betokens involuntary emergence, though it has been layered with cultural significance. Who is capable of blushing? And think even in terms of fashion, and the necessity of adding a blush, of evincing moral indignation or decency's outrage. The ability to blush, to show a purported inner life of morality, has delivered some troubling racialist output that no one wants to overlook. So that might be a nice thesis or dissertation, the history of a blush. Or it's also called a flush sometimes. You're flushed. One never complains to the right person. On ne se plaint jamais à la bonne personne. I don't know why I have to say that in French. Have you ever complained and it's the wrong person and they just shut you down or something? But in any case, how does one register a complaint? Who has the right to complain? Does the complaint issue from a place of impotence, or does it have the potential to move mountains? Or more scaled down, can it arrive at any destination whatsoever? Perhaps the complaint serves as an utterance reserved for minoritized stances and diminishments. Dash. Or are their envoys precisely banned from complaining, raising objections? In other words, are certain minors and minorities even allowed to complain? Or will they be subject to a big smackdown? Does authority deign to complain? And can power dispense with the urge to complain? Stop complaining, woman, loops through internal sound systems, misogynist and unhinging. Do real men complain? Or is the complaint not radically incompatible with the worldly thrusts of any lean, mean fighting machine? What about the silent complaint? So many questions, so little time. Let's see. Driving on the New Jersey Turnpike, I asked the man in the toll booth how he was doing as he's inhaling all of this pollution. I was met with the reply, I can't complain. The doorman at a friend's building who had broken his leg and received no workers' compensation too could not complain, as well as a street vendor from Nepal who stayed in his container under impossible conditions of overheat or winter blizzards. He too cannot complain. Whenever I go to him with tea or iced tea, depending on the season, just I can't complain. I wondered about this calm, glacialized resignation, the grace of the destitute, scenes of mute compliance. Close to this experience, but matching it elsewhere, a friend of mine, elegant and close to the vest of all manner of things, used to say, don't complain, don't explain. The stiff upper lip thing, reticent and pulled together, entirely in keeping with his Irish-British demeanor. God, one could say, complains all the time. Biblical celebrities have taken signature positions. Job accepts, Jeremiah laments. Sarah, she laughs, also a type of complaining. That's the panorama shot I offer and will come in for a close-up elsewhere. I would love to talk to you about what happens when Sarah laughs and God gets very pissed off, and then Abraham falls on his face laughing and God gives him a high five. So who's laughing with whom, what kind of community is implied or created here is something that you might want to consider. The complaint itself comes off as aggressive, impolite, unhöflich, leaving victims in the quagmire of an aporetic trap, or a number of double binds. On the side of the unsavory and dubious, something that overly discloses and so cannot be viewed simply as relating to what is true. I purposefully swerve from the cultures of lament in order to clear the deck for the complaint. No doubt a downgrade and awkward scramble, in terms of the prestige of any presentation of solemn assertion. By putting the focus on the complaint rather than on lament without opposing them, I am seeing about the possibility of updating the fate of the lament into a modern tonality and rhetorical arrangement. The lament carries some gravity, rises above itself to address an often inaccessible alterity. It has a rich and persuasive musical and poetic history to back it up and steer it forward. The complaint is of another order, something that the Bible itself tries to send through some anger management program. Dropped off to fend for itself without transcendental imprinting or ontotheological breeding, the complaint bears a tinny-tiny voice, peeps up whiny and shrill, secondary in the lineup of contestatory uprisings that language has hosted, pushed to the back row of challenging syntactical maneuvers. The lament stands a paradoxical ground, for it wants its own abolition. So the lament wants to do away with itself, hoping to stamp itself out. The lament cries, I want an end to this suffering. See, this would be a provisional difference between lament and complaint. The complaint won't shut up, but the lament laments that it's not over. The desired invalidation, the self-ending of itself as lament bears down hard, even when issued from the knowing stance of dilemma and self-obstruction, not being able to put an end to its case and condition. Not so much with the complaint, which seems in terms of its downgrade and modernization relentlessly reproducible, mechanically set to repeat its hollowed message, survive its expiration. One might even venture to say, though such distinctions can only be wobbly and provisional, that the lament has known itself to be affined to mourning, to loss, and calling out to and even from its lost object. The complaint, by preliminary contrast, sidesteps any ritual assertion of mourning. Resisting a fixed relation to loss, the complaint seems unable to mourn. This is something that we've been working on, mourning disorders and the refusal to mourn. Unable to let go, the complaint may well indicate a symptomal snag and refusal, a mourning disorder. To the extent that the complaint cannot mourn, it shares the stances and existential allowances of melancholia and sister disorders. One thinks of the grinding machines that run the language centers of chronic complainers. So, I want to show how the complaint revs up the critical engine as well. Is any critique not a complaint, or not throwing something into the field of the complaint? But I would like to consider how the complaint, companion to grievance, implies melancholia and unleashes the energy of protest. I have always been fascinated by those who do not raise their little finger to protest, who dare not complain in the proud whistleblower poise of landing their complaint. Admittedly, a very risky business. The non-complainers get all the credit, staying within the boundaries of coded gracefulness. It is not graceful to complain. My dilemma, ego ideal wants me to be graceful, but I must complain. Sometimes I want to raise myself to the dignity of the unsounded complaint. It would be more comfortable to pull back, stop howling, go soft and compliant. though compliancy, as Phyllis Wheatley, Poetry of Slavery's Wreckage, has taught us, also bunks with the complaint, following a syntax of holding back and breaking rhyme. So one can be radically compliant, as this great poetess is, African-American slave, who pretends to be going with the power, but she just makes some micro movements or nano maneuvers and launches a complaint. So any good Nietzschean would comprehend by now that at least two valences uphold the complaint. Even a bad Nietzschean must concede this point. So how's your energy? Can I go on for 5 more minutes? Can you handle it? Okay, thanks. I don't have a need or an avidity to do this to you. So if you just shut up already, you can tell me that and pause me. So I'm almost done complaining, okay? There's good complaining. Now, as a Nietzsche baby, I'm broadcasting that there's good complaining and bad complaining, a noble and a decadent complaint. These can be further fissured around Freudian tracts that cover all sorts of minor scaling of the complaint as culture, behavioral grid, cult strength, medical description, cultural queasiness, the so-called discontent squatting in cultural Unbehagen, or lamentable weakness and narcissistic soft spot. The constant complainer whimpering with no off switch, grinding down on world, can come from a place of weakness, wearing away any vitality that life has to offer, whining to exhaustion, I don't know if you know such folks, shutting down responsiveness regardless of the push-off point from referential injury. The complaint takes over. You don't even know if there's an injury anymore at the root of it. On the other hand, following the lineage of Nietzsche's noble traitor, something we should talk about, how Nietzsche affirms the noble traitor, the noble betrayer. One could imagine the bold complainers, the noble complainers who muster up courage to say what wrongs are being in common and lights up the bright sense of justice, who risk incivility in the name of civility, taking to the trans-feminist lookout post, the in-your-face act-uppers, and those who take to the streets, advocate life's capacity to power up and adjust vivaciously. These opposing stances of complaint collapse into and support each other, contaminate, and cross over into the fields of their adversarial type. I refrain from saying that the constant whiner is not the most noble. What do I know? Even though we culturally pitch against all forms of ingratitude, no matter how dire the conditions are from which they siren up. This is where Nietzsche comes in strongly, for the weak may mask the strongest. And then there's something missing. So let me just say, the weak may mask the strongest. So we can't even tell if the complaint comes from a weak or a strong place, because sometimes the strongest, the meek, will inherit the earth, and they're the most power pumped. Okay? So, let me offer a blessing now. Let us call up Babel. For many years, I have worked on the bare signifier trans, which accounts for so many of the highly invested movements and transfigurations to which we find ourselves commonly tied. Besides the many possible trajectories, illicit and altogether conventional, of the transferential implication of the work on translation ranks high on the list of its potentiating qualities. And I want to honor those of you who are translating and who are working in so many different Babelized forms. In the Tour de Babel essay that some of us continue to study, Derrida, passing through or as Benjamin, opens up the eventfulness of our Babelization, the many transgressions and boundary assaults that led to punishing paybacks, exposing the divine reactivity to the push for transparency, one language. Someone registered a complaint of biblical proportions. I don't think so, Yahweh said, kicking down the first skyscraper, or rather turning into a condemned site, a generator of dissemination. You may remember that it was the Shems, the name. So I'm moving here with dissemination and dissemination. Turning on the name, the Shem, disseminating into far-flung approximations. Henceforth, to fast forward, translation ruled. This is what the Bible wants, translation, dissemination, so that translation and non-transparency should rule, bringing home our broken relation to sense and meaning. Why is this particular story of divine grievance, a tipping point of the complaint, important for us today, yanked into ever-regressing territories of national religious anxieties and their destructive analogues? The greater part of the lexicon of contemporary United States forms of injustice stems from Bible-thumping quoting activity. Even in God We Trust has no footing in the book of books, for the Bible has something to say about its quotability and the way complaints are lodged in its name according to the way it pages us. Benjamin set this understanding on us, and Derrida cleared the way. Babel means that you cannot, under any circumstances, say, because the Bible says so. One is prohibited from saying anything with the secured sense of biblical injunction or assertion because transparency itself is under biblical lock. The words are constitutively scrambled, installed, and at its core, the Bible trembles with rage under gag order because God himself or herself has launched the trans and forbidden any settlement with assured intention or meaning or election or sanction or homophobic announcement or clear-cut Occupy statement to the extent that the Bible, has incorporated a trans machine, altering, transferring, transvaluating, transposing, and translating from the ground up endlessly. Traumatic norming comes into play only in the mode of delayed reactivity, at the site of discredited utterance, which is a gift of divine violence. Thank you, God. Thank you for giving us Babel, baby Babel, as your language of choice. Thank you for the gift of unreadability, for the complaint that was thundered on the myth of transparency, the urge toward one meaning, monography, and for enjoining the task of the translator. Thank you for the irreparable damage you gifted us with, without which we would have license to think and say that we know. Thank you.